how often do we actually have to say that the world doesn't make sense? That rules do not apply? Or they apply for a minute, or they apply for a month, or they apply for a few years. And you have to live in the story and in your political actions in a state of constant uncertainty.
Sound bites blur intent. Clickbait headlines twist the truth. Deepfake videos destroy shared reality. And that makes critical thinkers and clear-eyed observers like M. Gessen all the more needed. Gessen does not talk down to people who are scared, does not suggest you should not believe your eyes, as the famous George Orwell quote goes. Gessen does not downplay fear. As a journalist living in Moscow during Vladimir Putin's ascendancy, Gessen brings a perspective on democracy that slices knife-like through the stories America tells. Gessen shows how in a few short years, we have changed from a people who thought of ourselves as a nation of immigrants to a country zipping up its borders, unsure of what truth means. Through their writing, Gessen sits with you on the page and discusses what happens when you no longer recognize the country you live in as your own. I'm Rebecca Hoogs, the Executive Director of Seattle Arts and Lectures. You're listening to Sal On Air, a collection of talks from the world's best writers from 38 years of Seattle Arts and Lectures. Author of 11 books, Gessen is an opinion writer for the New York Times and a distinguished professor, critic, historian, and journalist. When Gessen visited Sal, their most recently published book was Surviving Autocracy, but they opened up to the Sal audience about a work in progress, including political dissidence, the underground system of culture and community that evolved in a besieged Poland, and the feeling of uncertainty that those who live within a totalitarian regime must reckon with. Following the reading, Gessen is joined by University of Washington professor Margaret O'Mara for a conversation ranging from the role of journalists against authoritarian regimes, independent media, propaganda, and where wars are waged today, from the battlefield to the internet. This is Sal On Air.
Thank you. Thank you. It's so good to be here. And what a beautiful introduction and what a great poem by Zinnia. So since I'm speaking at an organization devoted to story, I thought I would talk about the problems I'm having with story. And I always find it more interesting to talk about the book that I'm working on or struggling with than things that I've already written. So that's what I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to be talking about the book that I've been working on for longer than I care to say, actually. I took a leave from it to write Surviving Autocracy, and then I came back to it. And then I was about a third of the way through writing it when Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine started. And that caused a kind of crisis for me, and I mean, it obviously caused a crisis for the world, and particularly for Ukraine and Ukrainians. But in terms of writing the book, it threw into question some of the basic assumptions that I had been using to shape it, and to shape the narrative. And that's actually what I want to talk about, is how things sort of broke down narratively, and how I've been thinking through putting them back together. So first, let me tell you about the history of the theoretical concept that underlies the book. The book is called, and I'll get to why it's called this, it's called The Certainty of the Reality of the Possibility. And It's a quote. I'll get to whose quote it is. But for now, let me talk about where the idea for the book came from, or where the concept that I'm basing it on came from. The concept is the concept of the parallel polis. And it comes from a bunch of conversations that Polish and Czech dissidents had in the 1970s. And I found the story of these conversations incredibly moving and dramatic. So after 1968, which for Eastern Europe was also a year of protests, like it was for Western Europe, but it was a year of protests that were brutally crushed. In 1968, both Czechoslovakia and Poland had large-scale protests, primarily led by youth. And in Czechoslovakia, they ended with then the government, the then government, instituting a number of liberalizing reforms under the sort of general banner of socialism with a human face. So something that was based on the ideals of the Communist Party, but without the totalitarianism. So they lifted censorship, they allowed organizing, they allowed protest, they looked forward to liberalizing the regime further, and then Soviet tanks rolled in. And the protests were brutally put down. The protests were brutally put down without the participation of Soviet tanks in Poland as well. And then the dissidents, the protest leaders, who perhaps did not yet think of themselves as dissidents, they were only coming into that identity because they thought that protest was possible, that they could meaningfully speak and act and create change in the country. So then, as they were sort of transforming into dissidents, so people who were differently minded but could not meaningfully act and meaningfully speak and create change, they had to grapple with the question of what it meant for them to have lived through this uplifting moment of protest, but also what they could do if they could not actually influence the regime, and if confrontation with the regime resulted in just one thing, which was them going to prison. And they spent a good decade trying to figure out how they could think about it and what they could do when there was nothing they could do. So they were exchanging essays. In one of the most incredible stories of this whole conversation, they were actually meeting up to talk. Now, meeting up to talk was no trivial task because they couldn't actually travel to each other's countries. Most of them had had to surrender their foreign travel passports and were under surveillance. And then they figured out that in the mountain range that separates these two countries, there was a path. It was called, as it happens, the path of people's friendship. And there was a spot where conceivably groups from both countries could hike to legally, and so they could gather there. Now, these were not hikers. These were smokers and readers and writers. But in order to meet, they were willing to hike through the mountains. And they had two of these meetings. They recall them as extraordinary events, right? These moments of conversation that made them feel that things were possible. In every meeting ended with them signing some kind of resolution that had a lot of very big words, but basically boiled down, and this is a summation of one of the participants, to saying, we're here and we want democracy. And then they were caught, and they could no longer meet in that spot. They used the path of people's friendship for many, many years to come They used it in particular to smuggle things back and forth between Poland and Czechoslovakia. It proved very useful because things could be smuggled, manuscripts could be smuggled from one country to the other and then printed, and then in printed form, printed in these underground printing shops, and then in printed form smuggled back. And the reason this made sense was that it actually completely flustered the police in either country, which were looking for the underground printing shop that could be traced back from the printed material that they were finding, but it couldn't be traced back because it was in the other country. So these, this printed material was being transported in backpacks. But the conversation continued, and so the question was, what is to be done when there is nothing to be done? And after about a decade, this concept began to emerge that in a totalitarian regime, which is completely impervious to any kind of political engagement, is impervious to influence, you didn't have to be in confrontation with the regime. What you could do is you could construct what the mathematician and philosopher Václav Benda called the parallel polis. He wrote a very short essay. It was called The Parallel Polis. It was about 5 pages. And he outlined this idea for creating something that was just separate, that just existed according to a different set of rules. And he gave 2 examples that were completely different, and they were quite intentionally chosen as very different examples to demonstrate that this thing not only was possible, the certainty of the reality of the possibility, but also already existing. Right? So one example that he used was the very rich underground cultural life of both countries, both Poland and Czechoslovakia, where people were distributing printed material, but samizdat, right, which is literally translated as self-publishing, but also were staging underground theater, there was underground music, there was a lot of underground culture. The other example he used was less intuitive for a dissident. It was the shadow economy. And he used it to demonstrate that people were perfectly capable of stepping outside the completely dysfunctional central planning system and reaching, understanding, creating agreements across difference with people that they didn't necessarily know very well, without being governed by the state, without, in fact, being governed by any formal law. And so he proposed that this is what could be done. Václav Havel then, in his much better known essay, The Power of the Powerless, called this the working model of the future in the present. He suggested, this is a loose translation, but what he suggested basically is that when people found spaces within a totalitarian regime, which he actually called a post-totalitarian regime because it didn't exert direct pressure on every person at every given moment, so people could find spaces outside of the state's control, and then they created these parallel societies, these parallel polis, and then when the regime collapsed under its own weight, we would find that the future was already there. We had already created it. This essay, The Power of the Powerless, which I highly recommend reading if you haven't, found its way to Poland, in addition to being distributed in Czechoslovakia. And we have documentation of how incredibly influential it was for young organizers who were just then starting to rise up against price hikes and working conditions in the shipyards in Poland. Right? This is what we know as the Solidarność, the Solidarity trade union movement. And one of the statements by a 23-year-old shipyard worker at the time, I think he was an electrician, said that what reading The Power of the Powerless allowed him to do was understand not only what they were doing, they knew what they were doing, right? They were organizing, they were protesting, but why they were doing it and how it could have meaning, right? How it could have a life past the protests that they were having right at that point, and how it could connect them to other people in Poland. Meanwhile, in Warsaw, a bunch of intellectuals got together and created the Intellectuals Committee for Support of the Protesting Workers. And this was really a large-scale sort of experiment in this idea of the parallel polis, right? Because the parallel polis implies that it's not people who come from the same circle. It's not your closest friends. It's not people who think exactly the way you do. It's actually something that exists and necessitates work across difference, right? So there were these intellectuals from Warsaw. There were these trade union organizers in the shipyards. There were underground publishers who were allowing the trade union organizers to put out their message so that other union organizers could read about when protests were happening elsewhere, which made it so much more difficult for the government to crack down on these protests as they had done before. And then, as outlined in these essays that had resulted from this dialogue, people started organizing underground universities. It was called the Flying University. It was something that existed for a number of years in Poland and really connected people to this inspiring, this really exhilarating the political culture that they could see being born. And even after martial law was imposed under pressure from the Soviet Union, this underground system continued to exist. And in Poland, in fact, exactly what Havel had predicted would happen happened, which is that the totalitarian regime collapsed more or less under its own weight once the Soviet Union pulled back from Poland, stopped exerting pressure on the Eastern European parts of its empire. The government started collapsing, and it sat down with representatives of the Solidarity movement, which at that point was much more than a trade union movement. It was this large political movement, and negotiated a handover of state power to them. And so as a result of those negotiations, in the summer of 1989, Poland had parliamentary elections. Poland, before that, the censorship laws were lifted, allowing for media to exist, allowing, therefore, for elections to happen. And so in the fall of 1989, Adam Michnik, the newly installed editor of what was for decades after, and still is, I think, the most important newspaper in Poland, Gazeta Wyborcza, and one of the authors of the essays in this exchange, and one of the people who had hiked the path of people's friendship. So he hiked the path of people's friendship again. He and a delegation of Polish parliamentarians went over the mountain, but this time they didn't stop at the meeting point. They actually descended down the other side of the mountain into Czechoslovakia and went and visited Václav Havel at his house. Václav Havel had just been released from prison in Czechoslovakia. And so Michnik, according to eyewitnesses, is telling Havel about what miraculous, but also not miraculous, like also exactly what they predicted. Stuff has happened in Poland. And Havel is listening to all of this and says, yeah, that's Poland. This could never happen in Czechoslovakia. And Michnik says, mark my word, you're going to be president before the end of the year. And Havel looks at Michnik like he is out of his mind, which arguably he is at that moment, except by the end of the year, Havel is president of Czechoslovakia. So that's the really great story, the really great theoretical concept at the basis of this book. And I was traveling around the world trying to figure out how to identify projects that I should write about in the present. So I started with an organic farm in the occupied West Bank. Something that exists in conditions that are as close to conditions of totalitarianism as I think exist in the world today, where I can still go and report on it. And then I was going to other places. It was very important for me to make the argument that this doesn't have to be limited to totalitarian regimes, and that also this is not an anti-state project, right? This is something else that we're talking about. But the bigger problem I was having was with the metrics that we usually use to measure if something is successful. So when I first started talking to people about this project, smart people that I respected would immediately say, "Yeah, but that's not scalable." And we're like, "Oh, right, yeah, that's not scalable." And so it took me maybe a year to say, "So, it's not scalable." But then, what was I going to come up with as a replacement for scalability? This is not an easy thing for me to wrap my mind around. I grew up in the Soviet Union, and the rest of the time I've lived in the States. I really think that things should be big. And then I thought, okay, well, maybe I should look at projects that are reproducible. But the problem with looking at projects that are reproducible is that, and this also took me much longer than I would care to admit to understand, that I was looking for universal rules. I was looking for universally applicable models. Not universally applicable ideas, but universally applicable models. And that doesn't work very well, because something that is revolutionary, that is transformative in the West Bank isn't in Detroit. Or maybe it is. Right? But just looking at whether something is reproducible misses the point. So that took a while. Then I finally decided that the metrics I would use is something generative. Does something come of it after? Right? Oh yeah, and this is where I also got past the point where something has to last forever. So all the things that had given me comfort, like this thing can be huge, this thing can be all over the place, it can be networked, and it's long-lasting, it's sustainable, right? It turned into something much mushier, like, is it great, and does it also give birth to something great? Or does it give people the experience of being part of something great? Does it actually give people the experience of being political actors? So finally, I figured that out. And so the book was a third of the way through writing the book when the full-scale invasion of Ukraine started. And weirdly, none of the projects in my book were actually in Russia. But a lot of the people that I knew in Russia had been involved in parallel polis-type projects for obvious reasons. Russia had become a totalitarian regime. People were robbed of sort of what we think of as normal tools of political action in a society that functions somewhat democratically. They also, a lot of the people I knew came from the tradition of thinking about these things, and many of them had read these essays, if not the Parallel Polis, then certainly The Power of the Powerless. So they were involved in meaningful, great projects that I had a lot of respect for, or I had come to have a lot of respect for. Because a lot of those projects had begun as something that I saw, having been a journalist and a magazine editor in Moscow, I saw my friends give up journalism for the very simple reason that it was no longer possible to practice journalism, and find other ways to try to make the world around them better, which mostly involved making the lives of other people that they could work with directly better. My closest friend started working with people who were in institutions for the mentally disabled, and created a vast project for, I just said vast like it's a good thing. I mean, it's an impressive thing, but the first thing that she did is she created a home for 11 people, 11 kids who with severe mental disabilities, who had been institutionalized and were taken out of these institutions, put in a completely different environment that allowed them to develop, allowed them to have human connection, allowed them to have education, allowed them to live lives. And it was a bit of a struggle for me to understand that changing the lives of 11 people who are to various extents aware of how much their lives have changed, is a political act and is a way of changing the world around you. And other people I knew were involved in other amazing projects that were making the lives of people living in Russia better. And then the full-scale invasion began, and it threw them into crisis, because each one of them had to ask themselves, what had they been doing, and had they unwittingly been contributing to sustaining this regime? If you're making it easier, if you're making it better for people to live in a country, and then that country wages a colonial genocidal war, then what is the meaning of what you have been doing? Have you been helping patch up the facade of this regime? Some people I knew had literally, or almost literally, been helping to patch up the facade of the regime by devoting their time to creating bikeways in Moscow. It was more complicated were people who were doing the kind of work that I described my best friend doing. But of course, people like my best friend were much more torn up about it than the people who had been building bikeways. So they all left the country, and they all had to struggle with the question of what their moral responsibility had been when they thought they were making the world better, what their moral responsibility was now, what was their responsibility for having been Russians, what was their moral responsibility to the people they had left behind, what was their moral responsibility to Ukrainians, which is a way of asking how you know what you're doing, and how, if you're inside a thing that is monstrous, when you realize that the thing is monstrous, or when you admit that the thing is monstrous, how do you think about how long the thing has been the thing? And how you think about, again, this idea that Václav Benda pioneered, that you don't have to be in confrontation with the thing. So this is where we come to the story part of the story, which is that I realized I can't tell a straightforward story about this. And it made me think a lot about what we do as journalists, which is that we make sense for people, we tell stories about things, often about things that don't make sense. And that perhaps more often than we care to admit, that act of storytelling, as comforting as it is also an act of lying. How often do we actually have to say that the world doesn't make sense? That rules do not apply? Or they apply for a minute, or they apply for a month, or they apply for a few years. And you have to live in the story and in your political actions in a state of constant uncertainty. So that threw into question this whole project of recognizing, of figuring out what this criterion that I was going to bring everything together under was going to be, right? So I had rejected scalability, I had rejected reproducibility, I had rejected sustainability, I had finally settled on generativity, and maybe that's not so great either. Fortunately, I had really smart people to talk to. And one of the people that I was talking to, that I have been talking to throughout writing this book, is a humanist, geographer, economist named Catherine Gibson, who teaches at the University of Western Sydney. She has been writing for much of that time with her now late co-author about non-capitalist economies and about small projects. And her argument has been all along that that when we subscribe to big theories, we miss everything that falls outside of those theories. We just act, we speak, and we write as though those things don't exist. And a lot of her work has been focused on finding the things that do exist, on documenting projects that, if you analyze everything in terms of big economy, in terms of wage labor, in terms of monetary exchange, you just don't see, because that language doesn't work to explain those things. And in our initial conversations, were incredibly useful to me because they pointed me toward individual projects that I could write about as parallel polis, and because they also taught me to think about things lacking language, because a lot of the time the people I was talking to couldn't describe what they were doing to me in a way that I could then put in the book. There were like many more iterations necessary for me to try to figure out what I was looking at. But this wonderful thing that Catherine said to me in one of our conversations was that she was in favor of weak theory. And I was like, well, what do you mean, weak theory? I said, well, like the opposite of strong theory. That's a very hard thing for a journalist, I think, to embrace, because, of course, again, in journalism, we always fall back on certainties. We always fall back on the idea that we can tell a clear story about something. In fact, that's usually the challenge. When I go out to report on something, I gather material, I take notes, I interview people until the story emerges. But what if there's no really clear story of or what if there are many stories all at the same time and they're contradictory? That make things so much harder. But it does make it a little bit easier to think of the thing, to think of what I'm trying to describe as actually belonging to a category, but not the category of strong theory, but the category of weak theory. But of course that means that there's this idea that rules could be universal, that I could take one thing and apply it to another place. This idea it's useful to a point. We still can't I still can't tell the story unless I compare things to one another, I relate them to one another, but I also have to be ready to drop the comparison and move on to the next thing, which does make it so much harder, but also somewhat more interesting to write. But I'll give you some examples so that it's clear what I'm talking about. So one thing that I read about when I was reading the Czech and Polish dissidents was that they outlined particular ways of being different from the actual regime. So there was the suggestion that you could create a parallel polis that functioned according to a different set of rules in a discrete area, say in the area of economics, or in the area of religion, or in the area of education. And then in the rest of it, this particular sort of polis that the project encompasses can exist in the regime's framework. And at first, I understood that to mean that I could sort of figure out how something was different from the existing regime, and then see how other things were different from the existing regime in the same way. And so, for example, going back to the West Bank for a second, when I was writing about the farm in the occupied West Bank, I noticed that it was very important for the activists that I was talking to be separate from the system of international aid that completely dominates the economics of the West Bank. Everything that happens in the Palestinian autonomy, in one way or another, happens because an international aid organization thinks it's necessary, or approves of it, has given money to it, has signed off on plans for it. And so for a lot of people who were working on this particular project, the first meaningful act of resistance was stepping out of that system. All of them had worked in various internationally funded NGOs. Step out of that system, be able to criticize that system, and figure out ways to act politically outside of that system, as dominant as it was there. But then it didn't take me very long to figure out that this is not a rule you can apply universally. Just saying that that everywhere where there's a lot of international aid, you have to do the opposite or the other thing or a different thing than international aid funds is really not terribly constructive, right? It was a very local rule. It was a kind of weak theory. It worked right there, and it is very important right there. But a thing that works elsewhere, a thing that becomes an organizing principle and a unifying thing, is something is a different thing elsewhere. And so now I finally get to the source of the quote, the certainty of the reality of the possibility. It comes from the writing of one of my favorite thinkers, Erich Fromm, who was a humanist social psychologist. And it's funny, I feel like I sort of, in my writing, I develop according to a trajectory that is sort of outlined by Fromm. He wrote an amazing book in 1940 called Escape from Freedom, which if you haven't read, go out and get. It's the best book on totalitarianism. I say this as Hannah Arendt rolls over in her grave. I couldn't live without reading Arendt, but it's very complicated to read Arendt. And I'm convinced that that she and Erich Fromm were basically trying to describe the exact same things. She using political theory, and he using an understanding of human emotions and human needs. And so when he was, this book, Escape from Freedom, which is an amazing short book, which has an introduction that says in which he apologizes for writing the book sloppily and very quickly, but explains that he felt that he had to write it very fast because he felt that the world was on the verge of catastrophe. This introduction is written in 1940 by an exiled German Jew, and so he has a theory of what draws people to what makes totalitarianism possible. And his theory is that there are times in human experience when enough people are so overwhelmed by the anxiety of having to invent themselves in an uncertain future that they would rather hand over their agency to somebody who will promise them certainty and stability and just take control of their lives. He talks about the difference between freedom from, which is freedom of the freedom from being controlled by others, by imposed rules, the freedom from having your parents tell you what to do, which is freedom we all want, and freedom two, which is the freedom to invent yourself, freedom to create new things, which can feel like a burdensome freedom, which can be a huge source of fear. Again, as I said, he and Arendt are describing very similar things. She talked about this as dislocation on an unprecedented scale, homelessness to an unprecedented depth. They're talking about the same period of history when people are feeling terrified and they opt for totalitarianism. But then, like many German thinkers who ended up in exile in the United States, Fromm looks around and realizes that some of what he's been thinking about is universal and therefore not exactly specific to the place and the moment that he was trying to describe. That perhaps things are fundamentally wrong with the way we conceive of society and we conceive of economy. And so he wrote a wonderful book called The Sane Society, in which he kind of argues against capitalism as an insane system and suggests that a society that was based, a society that's based not on what people produce, that bases people's value not on what they produce, but on their inherent humanity, would be sane, and everything else is insane. And then he wrote he did some wonderful writing about hope. And this is the writing that that informs my weak theory. And this, what he writes is that hope is the mood that accompanies faith, but he's very suspicious of the category of faith, right? So faith to him is something that renders a person passive and makes them just wait around for things to get better, right? It's this very American sort of tick of optimism. It's the way that often when I do a public appearance or I'm interviewed, I am asked as the last question to say something positive, right? To like tell people that everything will be okay. But it's not just the interviewer's problem, right? As I started breaking down this book that I have been working on and trying to deconstruct its narrative, I kept finding myself writing myself into a place where I would land on a generalization that said, but in the end it was all good and hopeful and portended a better future. And if I'm doing it after writing the books that I've written, then I really can't complain about anyone else doing it. So he writes that hope is the thing that you experience when you're doing something that may create the thing that you want to create, right? In other words, it's when you're working on a political project, on a project for a better future, and you see the certainty of the reality, of the possibility, that you derive hope from it, that you experience the mood that accompanies faith. And I think ultimately, the meaning of all of these projects that I have been reporting on and that I have tried to assemble into this book, and that I will, I swear, assemble into a book, is that they create this mood. They create this experience of hope, because people see the certainty of the reality of the possibility, and they see that they can create a working model of the future in the present. Thank you.
We'll be back for the rest of the event with M. Gessen in a moment. But first, I wanted to tell you about an event coming up with Patrick Radden Keefe on April 22nd. The mastermind of narrative reporting, who brought us Say Nothing and Empire of Pain, delves into the mysterious death of a teenager and his family's search for truth in his new book, London Falling. Known for his investigative storytelling, Keefe once again brings us a tale of danger, corruption, false identity, and humanity you'll have to read to believe. Tickets are available now for both in-person and online attendance at lectures.org. And now, more from M. Gessen.
Wow, thank you. I have a lot of really great questions from all of you in the audience or out there in virtual audience. And I hope that, and that some of them kind of align with bring some similar notes and some similar themes. So if you haven't asked a question, you can go to, as Rebecca said at the top, you can go to Slido, or you can go to your pre-event email, and we'll have instructions. There's still room. I've got my live iPad here. All this technology. But I do want to start, pick up a bit on the parallel polis and how it is, well, the broader role of journalists like you. And I also want to note that you are the recently appointed to the Craig Newmark professor at the Craig Newmark School, the City University of New York, where, among other things, brand new news, so that's wonderful.
Thank you.
In addition to writing 12 books, she's a full-time professor, so I'm feeling like I need to get cracking. And doing really important work on Russian alternative media, and so I'd love to. I think it would be really interesting to hear more about that work and what that's doing. But just to pick up on journalists in the news, the detention of Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich, and which you just wrote about for the New Yorker a few days ago, and how that, and really wrote, I think, really fascinating, looking at drawing in this longer history of how foreign correspondents have navigated and been treated. Could you talk some more on that and kind of connect this to these broader, very important questions you've brought up about how pushing back against totalitarianism and authoritarianism, and what you think the state of play is and what we need to be paying attention to here?
So, and the arrest of Evan Gershkovich is obviously terrifying. He is charged with espionage, and I think, and in the piece that I wrote for the New Yorker, I tried to explain that it's, there's sort of this immediate reaction to say, hey, he was just doing journalism, And that's how most of the reporting in this country has worked. And the Wall Street Journal itself has said, oh, we deny the charges, he was just doing journalism. The thing is that for more than 10 years now, Russia has had laws on the books that make it very clear that anybody can be charged with espionage or high treason. High treason is basically the same acts of espionage but committed by a Russian citizen for doing regular journalistic work. Or not even necessarily journalistic. Basically, a person can be charged with espionage or high treason for doing anything for anybody. It's a very, very vague law that says things like anybody who gathers any information, it doesn't have to be classified. They don't have to have had access to it because they have a security clearance. And they can have gathered this information for the benefit, not necessarily of a foreign government, but any organization that may have aided a foreign government. So today, Vladimir Kara-Murza, who is a Russian political activist, former journalist, was sentenced to 25 years in a high-security prison colony for gathering information and gathering information in the instances and passing it on to foreign entities. And the instances cited are like things like his testifying in the Arizona State House about the Russian war in Ukraine, or his working for Russian political organizations in exile, such as Mikhail Khodorkovsky's organization called Open Russia, which has been declared by Russia an undesirable organization, which means that Russia views it as basically a state enemy. So Gershkovich's arrest, on the one hand, it's not a misapplication of law, right? It is actually exactly what this Russian law was written to do. And so in that sense, it sends an even more powerful message to foreign correspondents, which is basically get out, right? And that's something that's not even comparable to periods of like the worst political isolation, not even, even during Stalinist times. There were a lot of restrictions placed on foreign correspondence. And there was censorship, actual codified censorship of foreign correspondence in Russia, but at least they were there, right? Whereas now most media outlets have pulled their reporters from Russia, and I think they're right to do so.
So, and I think this picks up too with a couple of questions that are coming in about, for example, Gregory Scruggs has a question: how will PEN America conduct its Russian media archival project, for which you were an advisor? What outcomes do you anticipate from this project? Because not only if everyone has to get out, and this is also, you just recently reported on how exiled Russian journalists are trying to report the war from outside Russia. How does the truth get out, and how is this war reported on with everyone gone?
So I'm so glad word is out about RIMA, the Russian Independent Media Archive, which went live last week. This is a project that we conceived a little over a year ago, basically as soon as the full-scale invasion started. And the reason for it was very simple. So in the first week of the full-scale invasion, so the last week of February of last year, first week of March, almost all independent Russian journalists and all independent Russian media had to leave. And the reason they had to leave was because Russia, within the first week, instituted 2 different laws that basically made it a crime to call the war a war or to report on the war truthfully. It's called distributing disinformation and discrediting the armed forces. So So people fled and reconstituted themselves in places like Georgia, Latvia, Berlin, Amsterdam. They did an amazing job, right? These were people who were running while also trying to report the most important story of their lives, while also not having access physically to either Ukraine. Ukraine has been mostly closed to Russian journalists, including independent Russian journalists, understandably, and Russia, because they had to leave Russia, right? But what I was concerned about was that all of these independent media, which had been running on a shoestring anyway, had lost their funding, because most of them had no advertising. They survived on subscriptions, donations, and if they were widely distributed enough, on monetizing Google and YouTube advertising, right? But with, it's not even sanctions, it's more like the economic boycott regime that kicked in almost as soon as the invasion started. YouTube and Google turned off their any possibility of making money in Russia and off of Russian viewers and readers, which I think, every time you hear of something like that, just think about how much oil and gas Western governments are still buying from Russia, and how that's supporting the war effort, and how not letting people make money off of YouTube does nothing except hobble independent Russian media. They also couldn't receive donations because bank cards were cut off. They couldn't get subscriptions. So they're all surviving on emergency funding. And I thought, this emergency funding is not going to last forever. Once they stop paying for cloud storage, their archives will vanish, right? We think that the internet is forever, but it's not. It's only forever as long as somebody is paying for it. Yeah. So we decided to create an archive that would safeguard content created by independent Russian media. And our explicit goal is to create something that will make the end of this regime different from the end of the last regime. It's taken more than 30 years, and the job is still not complete, and in fact it's been reversed, to try to create an accurate historical record of Soviet terror. But we want this record, which is being created in real time, and Russian journalists continue to work and continue to do incredible stuff that no one else can do, including, for example, getting Russian military personnel to confess to war crimes on camera. A young reporter is sitting in Riga, and she's talking to an active duty Russian officer who actually is talking about what they've been doing, and she's getting him on camera. It's incredible stuff. And we want to make sure that that's safeguarded. We have also since realized that we should also start collecting state media, because they're all falsifying the record. They're already going in and deleting stuff from their archives. We are going to need that stuff too. And we also, of course, it's a living archive, so we're already starting to create content on the basis of it, starting to do research on it. And I encourage anybody here who works with Russia or is interested in doing any research on Russian media to get into RIMA, R-I-M-A, the Independent Russian Media Archive, which is hosted by Bard College, created in cooperation with Penn, and we want everyone to use it.
That's great. Good. Well, this is related to my own research, of course, on the tech industry, so it's a bit of interest here, but you're in a high-tech place, Seattle, right, where a lot of these tech companies are either headquartered or have a major presence. And I'm curious, just building on what you were saying about the absence, the cutting off of those platforms, has there been some reconsideration, and what do you think the American-based tech giants in particular can and should do to aid this information environment, and are any of them helping support this project?
I'm not aware of any of them helping to support this project, although we are using Amazon cloud services.
Like the rest of the world.
Well, no, not like the rest of the world. We're using them and not using Google because Google has been cooperating with the Russian regime and other totalitarian regimes around the world. It wouldn't be safe for us to use Google services. And Google also has not, at least as far as I know, up until this point, done anything about the way that the Russian regime weaponizes Google searches to spread its own propaganda, which is something that Russian activists have been trying to draw Google's attention to.
Well, just keeping on this, the question of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there are if you might imagine, a number of audience members do have questions about your thought on this. Robert Hirsch asked, the Finnish ambassador to the U.S. said last November the war in Ukraine can only be ended by the defeat of Russia on the battlefield. Do you share that view? Another questioner asked about what you think the end game or end of will be for Vladimir Putin. So, where do you sit on these weighty questions of geopolitics and where we are now?
So the first question, did I hear that correctly? That the war in Ukraine can only end with Russia's defeat on the battlefield? Yeah, I think I agree, because there's this common wisdom that all wars end in a negotiated settlement. That's not true. Not all wars end in a negotiated settlement, and this one can't end in a negotiated settlement because we know that Russia will not negotiate, or it will not negotiate in good faith. We know this because Russia has negotiated in the past with Georgia after the 2008 war in a settlement brokered by France, and since then violated repeatedly. Russia negotiated the Minsk agreements after the occupation of Crimea and the war in eastern Ukraine, and violated those agreements repeatedly. And basically we know also from the experience of the Chechen wars, and again from the earlier war in Ukraine, that any negotiated settlement with Russia will be used by Russia as time to regroup and to terrorize Ukraine and to then launch another offensive at some point, right? So there will be no actual peace as a result of a negotiated settlement. Now, the Russia I'm talking about is Putin's Russia. Right? If Putin dies or leaves by some other means before Russia is militarily defeated, then what I say doesn't necessarily apply. There's no other, there's some really scary men waiting in the wings in case Putin goes, including Yevgeny Prigozhin, who is absolutely terrifying as a warlord in Ukraine. But even for Prigozhin, this is not his war. There's nobody else for whom it's his war except for Putin. So, so that also, I hope, addresses the very common kind of, but why should we wish for Putin to leave when something worse can come along? No, that's actually something that if you read some history about the end of the death of Stalin, you'll find out that was a common trope late in Stalin's reign. Why should that after Stalin dies, something even worse may come along. And now, 70 years later, we realize it would have been really difficult for something worse to come along. That may be even more true now. As for Putin's endgame, he's certainly planning to die in office. He was also planning to never die. And how this actually plays out, I don't know. As a journalist, I'm not allowed to make predictions.
Fair point. Marcia asks, can you reflect on recent exposure of documents exposing extent of U.S. involvement and what that reveals? The leak of in the last week of the classified documents.
I've watched it with fascination, as everyone else has, I think, but I don't know that I have anything to add.
Extraordinary. It's 21-year-old airman on a Discord server. That's so is.
I mean, I find it most fascinating that this was just sitting there for a month until Russian Telegram channels picked it up, and then we saw it. Like, that is, to me, the most interesting part of the whole story.
Yeah, it's interesting. For some reason, it made me think about, I'm a fan of the Americans, which you worked on. And it's like, it's, how different things are now in the world of espionage and spycraft. You never know what may happen. There are a number of questions, as you might expect. One asking about the applicability of these, what we should think about when we think about these matters in terms of the United States, and your most recent book, Surviving Autocracy, about the Trump administration, which is extraordinary, and it took me back in ways that were
Sorry.
but also very nimbly written and nice, tight, short moments so you could dip into it and then take a deep breath and come back in. But I think there are so many kind of provocative and very important moments of reminding Americans of not being exceptional, and so for example, Chuck here asks, there may be a scalability question, but is there particular lessons from Russia that contextually people or organizations in the United States should heed? And so maybe building on your many insights in your last book and your thoughts about where we are now, what would you say on that?
Maybe the insight, I think, let's see. So I think the introduction said something about how I had this incredible foresight during the 2016 election to see how awful Trump was. And I think of this as actually a lesson I originally learned from the great gay activist and writer Larry Kramer, who I thought was possessed of an incredible catastrophic imagination. like he could imagine things that nobody wants to imagine. I'm not sure that that's a great trait to live with, but I think that living in a country like Russia, and certainly working as a journalist there, expanded my capacity for catastrophic imagination. And it was actually very clear to me, I think in the spring of 2016, when I was talking to a friend, and I said something about Trump having locked in the nomination, the Republican nomination. He said, "Oh no, that's not possible." I said, "Well, what do you mean it's not possible? Like, he's locked in the nomination." And he said, "But I just can't imagine Republicans allowing this to happen." And I thought, you know what? If you can't imagine something, that's your problem. But like, it's not just it's your problem, but it's your problem, right? And it's a lot of the time it's all of our problem. And in a way, it's a blessing. It's what in calmer times keeps us calm and sane and cohesive as a society. But in times of crisis, I think is counterproductive, because if we can't imagine Trump being elected president, if we can't imagine Roe v. Wade being overturned, or as so many of my friends in Russia couldn't imagine Russia staging a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. I mean, it was really, I was in both Ukraine and Russia in January and February of 2022. And my friends in both places were saying, but that's not possible, right? And, I remember like having this conversation with two friends in Kiev in late January 2022. And one of them, this incredible investigative journalist, was saying, but they're like saying that the American intelligence is saying they're going to march to Kiev, but it's like 400 kilometers. And I was thinking, that's really not very far. But what she was trying to say was that this is unimaginable. I can't, I can't live with the idea of this happening. And I understand it, and I also can't live with the idea of this happening. I still can't live with the idea of this happening. But we all kind of have to work on our catastrophic imaginations. That's the long-winded answer to your question of what are the lessons.
Yeah, what do we do? Well, I think one of the things that clearly comes out in your writing is how history helps perhaps not cultivate our catastrophic imaginations, but help us recognize that things are indeed possible. That this doesn't come out of nowhere. One of the observations you make in Surviving Autocracy is noting how September 11th was, you call it America's Reichstag fire. It was the moment when the rules got suspended and a new regime began, and that set a lot of things in motion. Can you talk more about that? How history comes, this is again a slightly self-interested question from the history professor, how history helps situate and contextualize and prepare us for what the possibilities might be.
Well, if I can actually, because I was just listening to you say those things, and I agree completely, right? Everything you say, I utterly agree that if we just think about history more, and if we imagine that the people living 50, 70, 100, 150 years ago were human just like us, and probably at some moment believed that everything that they knew had been forever and would be forever, and then it wasn't, that would really help us understand how history moves. And in fact, we're not any smarter inherently or any more anything than, say, people who lived through the rise of fascism in the 20th century. Our single advantage is that we know the history of the 20th century, right? That's the only thing that actually makes us different, is that experience, if we choose to claim it. But the sort of the flip side of that, and this has to do with what I was talking about in the talk, is that there's also a non-catastrophic kind of imagination, right? I mean, this ability, and the reason I'm so, I realize that in this book on the certainty of the reality of the possibility, pretty much every person who's thinking and writing I'm using is an exile. And my hypothesis is that there's something that happens to you when you live in exile, which is that you know that things aren't forever. You have experienced that other ways of living, other ways of organizing society are possible. And even if those are even worse than what you're seeing now, you definitely know that nothing is forever. And you definitely do not naturalize the way that things are done. So there's also a positive way of absorbing that history and the experience of displacement.
I think we have time for one more question, and we have so many good questions in here, and I'm trying to encompass all of the themes, the important. There's a lot. I should note that there are a number of really good questions and observations about the state of LGBTQI+ rights in both Russia and the United States, and your sense of where the state of play is in terms of public sentiment, and a parallel polis that is being created by social conservatives to try and, that's what the tone of a couple of the questions is, there are sort of efforts to undermine or push back against rights that have been extended in the United States. And that if there's but I also see a number of questioners asking, and I think we're in a room full of readers, obviously, and I imagine, judging from the demographics too, from what I know of the folks who come to these, a number of writers. And you are a very prolific writer, and you've written about many different things. And so perhaps I'd like to end not asking you for a happy ending. I'm going to not do that, but instead to talk a bit about how you do what you do, your process of, finding. You've talked quite a bit about, this latest project, how you came to other projects that have ranged, have had great range, including, I should also note, today, Boston Marathon Day, the 10-year anniversary of the bombing at the marathon. You wrote an extraordinary book about the two brothers. And kind of how you find your subjects, and also how you do it, how you have managed to, what your process is, and what, if you have any advice for especially younger and emerging writers in the room, what you would encourage them to think about.
So that's a lot of questions. I'm just going to focus on a couple of them. So one thing is, if you're writing a book, choose a subject that you're comfortable living with for at least a couple of years. Like something that you really are willing to go to sleep with and wake up with. I'm not going to say which book it was, but it wasn't the Marathon Bombers, but I once made the mistake of choosing a book that I just was bored with and miserable, waking up and going to sleep with for a couple of years. It was a huge mistake, and it wasn't. I don't think it was even a bad book in the end, and it did well, but it was the book that I was unhappiest writing. And generally I'm lucky. Some of my friends are miserable when they're writing. I'm very happy when I'm writing. I find writing easy, especially when I go into kind of trance-like state. But I also have realized over the years that a lot of what makes writing easy for me is creating ways of not writing. And I don't mean by that doing the laundry. That's like a whole other category of not writing. I mean that I do a lot of outlining and a lot of sketching and then a lot of editing. And so basically there's like no writing, right? Because, like, for example, if I'm writing a column, then I don't write it ever at all. I just, first I sort of walk around for a while or ride my bike and figure out how I'm going to start it. And then once I know how I'm going to start it, I just outline it. But when I outline, I have a rule, which is that I have to use complete sentences. A lot of people, I think, make the mistake of outlining in bullet points, which allows them to signal to themselves the ground that they want to cover, but doesn't force them to understand the logical connections between different sections. If you use complete sentences, you don't have that problem. It forces you into kind of logic. So once I've outlined using complete sentences, it turns out I already have a draft, so all I have to do is go in and edit the draft. And then it's done, and notice, no writing.
Genius.
And when I write books, it's basically the same thing on a larger scale. I do a short outline, a longer outline, then like an expanded outline, and then I type up the outline, and in the process I'm editing, and then it's done.
There we go.
Yeah.
You too can write 12 books. Well, this has been extraordinary. Thank you.
Thank you.
It was an honor to host M. Gessen in 2023 and to welcome them back on the podcast today. If you enjoyed listening, we welcome you to join us in person or virtually for our 38th season, as we hear from authors like James McBride, George Saunders, and Tommy Orange. Tickets and subscriptions are available at lectures.org. Thank you to the Seattle Arts and Lectures staff, board, and community, and thanks to all of you for listening. This show would not be possible without you. Our show is produced by Jack Straw Cultural Center with theme music by Daniel Spills. To hear more, subscribe from wherever you get your podcasts. And while you're there, rate and review us 5 stars so that more people can enjoy Sal on Air.